This is the Nietzsche Podcast. This episode has probably been the most difficult so far in terms of figuring out how to untangle this very, very deep topic. Because today we're talking about something which most people would think ought to be indisputably valuable to any scientist or philosopher or truth seeker out there, and that is the truth. After all, philosophy is synonymous with the love of wisdom, and therefore with seeking the truth. But unlike most philosophers, Nietzsche's relationship with the truth is very complex, and more importantly, his relationship with truth-seeking is complex. And because of the nature of this topic, at a certain point it almost becomes difficult to talk about, and you start to hit up on the very limitations of what's even possible to say with language. And so it becomes just one of the more difficult aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy to understand. And therefore, when it comes to the Nietzschean view of truth, there are a lot of bad takes out there. The reason for this isn't because people are being dishonest or because they're stupid or because they have ulterior motives, at least not in general. I mean, it certainly applies to some people. But I think it is because Nietzsche's views are developed over multiple works, and the complete threads of his ideas cannot be fully understood without following them throughout the whole canon. And sometimes there are things that are contradictory or appear contradictory, but if you understand the whole development of his thought, you can make sense of those contradictions. So first, how Nietzsche understood his relationship to the truth, it evolved, but it is a relationship, and he describes it here in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a short passage which he quotes himself before one of the sections of Genealogy of Morality. Nietzsche does like to occasionally quote himself, but anyway, here's the passage, quote, "Brave, unconcerned, mocking, violent. Thus wisdom wants us. She is a woman and loves only a warrior." End quote. So again, Nietzsche had almost a personal relationship to his own thoughts, feelings, and moods. It's not unusual for him to personify a concept, such as the truth. And of course it's a woman because he is a man and a philosopher, and truth is the thing he desires, the thing that he is chasing. He uses the same metaphor elsewhere when he begins the preface to Beyond Good and Evil with the question, "Supposing truth is a woman, what then?" And I love that quotation. When people, I just imagine someone hears about Nietzsche and invariably, they go and turn to one of his more famous books like Beyond Good and Evil. So they pick up Beyond Good and Evil, and the first thing they're hit with in the preface, the very first section, is that question, which just stops you in your tracks because it's such a perplexing question. And it immediately reframes, your thinking. It stops you cold. Supposing truth is a woman, what then? It's like, what does that mean? So Nietzsche gives some indication. I mean, he writes in that same preface that philosophers up to this point have been very inexpert with women. That they've been, the implication here is that they've been clumsy. They've been ungraceful. They're not willing or perhaps not able to court the truth or to seduce the truth. And so we might look at the common, the common wants of the philosopher, the common desires of the philosopher to dominate the opposing ideologies, to be proven right, to put truth into tables of categories, and so on. These are clumsy ways to win a woman's heart. So Nietzsche thinks that truth must be romanced, and to put things into more chauvinistic terms, won. The truth must be won, This is really the metaphor here, the heart of the metaphor. Philosophers must win the heart of the truth, just as the warrior in the old days, of the Neolithic hunters or Bronze Age city-states. The warrior distinguishes himself in battle, and thus, he wins the hearts of the women in his tribe, because a true woman loves only a warrior. And so again, we're speaking archaically here, but Nietzsche thinks archaically at times, and he's often opposed to modern ideas. So the metaphor for truth here, it's not as much of a statement about women or about truth with a capital T. This is a metaphor for the philosopher's relationship to the truth, as we've said, or what Nietzsche wants his own philosophical relationship to the truth to be. And so with that out of the way, there are a few basic principles when trying to understand the Nietzschean view of truth. And I've come up with 3 of them. Others could easily describe the Nietzschean approach to truth in a different way, or categorize these principles differently, or name more of them than 3. That's all fine. I'm not claiming an absolute blueprint here. This is just what I would consider to be 3 straightforward principles which, once fully understood, illumine the whole of Nietzsche's view on truth, or at least roughly the whole of it. And notice I'm not saying epistemology, because this is not, what I'm about to describe is not a system for determining how we know what we know about reality, or for being certain that our truth claims are correct. This is Nietzsche critiquing, evaluating the very activity of truth-seeking, and our valuation of the activity of truth-seeking, what Nietzsche calls the will to truth. To the extent that you could argue that this is epistemological, it's apophatically epistemological. So it's Nietzsche pointing out the limits of the will to truth and warning us against error. And these considerations are not really ontological either, because Nietzsche is not concerned with trying to determine the true nature of being or anything like that. Usually those pursuits are based on being tricked by language, or being tricked by our metaphysical prejudices, and Nietzsche's intention is that we not find ourselves tricked. So now, for the 3 principles. The first is, the truth is not the good. The second is, all truth is human. And the third is, humans need lies. So I'll clarify these briefly before diving into all the source material. The first principle, that the truth is not the good. What is meant by this is that Nietzsche inverts the relationship between the truth and the good as given by the ancient Greeks and continued by the Christians, and still a widely held secular prejudice to this very day. That is to say, the truth as synonymous with or correlated with goodness, what is moral, what furthers your health, happiness, and well-being. The truth will set you free, as we say, in an idiom we use in modern times. Or in Christianity, the promise of Jesus is, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So the correlation of all those things. Nietzsche says, no, the truth is sometimes unrelated to what is good for us, and is often harmful to the good. And he would even argue that, to some extent, too much truth will always be harmful. The second idea, or second principle, is all truth is human. That there is no means of escaping from the phenomenal world and making statements about the noumenal world. We never touch the true world directly. In fact, Nietzsche thinks we ought to abolish the very idea of a true world and live entirely within this definitively human world, which is the only world we'll ever know. Such an attitude means we can make no truly ontological claims in the sense of true being separate from human perception. Every single truth claim is therefore indelibly a human truth. Truth is therefore not separable from the human experience of it or from the human expression of it. So to draw a distinction there is folly. Finally, the third principle, and this is perhaps the scariest for many people, Nietzsche claims that human beings need lies. In fact, he even wonders at times how it is that human beings ever came to desire the truth at all. It doesn't make sense. If knowing the truth is harmful in many cases, why would we develop a will to truth? Many of the most cherished things to humanity, which ground humanity metaphysically and morally, the things that explain to us our place in the world and in our society and so on, are lies. He concludes, therefore, that man needs lies, or what we might call necessary fictions, if you don't want to use the term lies, that we need these in order to live. These three principles can all be posited separately, but importantly, if one doesn't really confront the full consequences of all three principles, they will not fully understand Nietzsche's view of truth. And so we might notice an immediate difference already in this sort of rough outline of the Nietzschean view of truth that I've given. We might notice a difference from someone like, for example, Jordan Peterson, and the sketch he gives of Nietzsche's views. I have to bring up Jordan again because he is perhaps the most popular spokesman for Nietzsche today, and his mistakes, therefore, have serious consequences. And so I'll quote from him from a lecture that Jordan gave, where he says something that he often repeats in one form or another. Quote, "One of Nietzsche's most famous maxims is that truth serves life, and that's a very different idea than the purpose of truth, say, as an accurate representation of the objective world," end quote. Now, this is not a direct quote of Nietzsche or one of his maxims, but there are passages in Nietzsche's work that purport a view of truth that sounds similar to this, so I'm not going to say Jordan is making it up out of whole cloth. But notice that Jordan's three-word explanation of Nietzsche's view on truth, that is, truth serves life, leaves out so much important information. Most importantly, it completely excludes the third principle, that lies serve life also. The idea of a truth serving life is one thing, and the idea of a lie serving life is quite another. And Jordan, to my knowledge, has never addressed this. I mean, really, he believes it is immoral to lie, ever. And actually, the Nietzschean view is much closer to the idea that truth, more often than not, harms life. The need to tear down the unquestionable beliefs of one's culture and subject those beliefs to rational inquiry. Well, this is what we might call Socratism, challenging all that was once taken for granted. This approach to life and knowledge, which is often seen as the birth of philosophy. Nietzsche thinks an excess of this attitude is the equivalent of a pathological condition, especially when taken to a societal scale. It heralds the doom of your society. And so the destruction of lies is what is harmful to life for Nietzsche. For in pursuit of truths, man only finds what is human. You search hard enough, and eventually one is left with no capital T truths at all. No absolute truths, only relative human truths. And so that is the consequence of having no quote-unquote true world, no noumenon. You get rid of the absolute, and you're left only with your own human perspective. So, while I understand what Jordan is trying to get at, and you will hear some of Nietzsche's writings that approximate that sentiment as we go on, truth serves life is actually a very bad summary of the Nietzschean attitude to truth. And I was guilty of falling for this characterization myself once upon a time. Because again, Jordan is not, strictly speaking, incorrect, but what he's done is that he's oversimplified things to the point of being wrong. So upon first glance, the formulation truth serves life or truth ought to serve life might make sense, but over time you realize that this is not a good interpretation because it doesn't give the entire picture. So now we'll discuss the principles in more depth and begin, of course, with the first principle, as I've laid out. The truth is not the good. To illustrate this, we'll look to Beyond Good and Evil, Book 2, Aphorism 39, and I'll quote about the first half of the aphorism. Quote, No one will readily consider a doctrine true simply because it makes us happy or virtuous, except perhaps the gentle idealists who go into raptures about the good, the true, and the beautiful, and allow all sorts of colorful, clumsy, and good-natured desirable things to swim around in confusion in their pond. Happiness and virtue are no arguments. But people, even prudent people, do like to forget that causing unhappiness and evil are by the same token no counter-arguments. Something could well be true, although it is at the same time harmful and dangerous to the highest degree. In fact, it could even be part of the fundamental composition of existence that people are destroyed when they fully recognize this point, so that the strength of a spirit might be measured by how much it could still endure of the truth, or, put more clearly, by the degree it would have to have truth diluted, sweetened, muffled, or falsified. But there is no doubt about the fact that evil and unhappy people are more favored and have a greater probability of success in discovering certain parts of the truth, to say nothing of the evil people who are happy, a species which moralists are silent about. Perhaps toughness and cunning provide more favorable conditions for the development of the strong, independent spirit and the philosopher than that gentle, refined, conciliatory good nature, and that art of taking things lightly, which people value in a scholar, and value rightly." End quote. The passage is fairly self-explanatory. It serves to decouple the association with truth and goodness. And Nietzsche even raises the possibility that perhaps existence is so constituted that to know the truth is to be destroyed, and perhaps there are parts of the truth that the evil person is better to equip to understand than a good person. We might think of the insights into human nature one gains during, extreme experiences, such as during wartime. Think on how a person who thrived in such an environment, a sadist or a barbarian, might be able to learn things about human nature that no one else could. That's basically like what the movie Apocalypse Now, or in the book it was based on, Heart of Darkness. That's what that text and the film are both about. Or it's one strong theme that through, horror and suffering and immorality and so on, one achieves a sort of enlightenment. One gains access to wisdom that civilized men don't have access to. So Nietzsche thinks, he hints at it at the end here, but he thinks there's a serious difference between a philosopher and a scholar. While most people would see those things as hand in hand, Nietzsche thinks that a modern scholar, or a scholar of his own day, they were not capable of becoming great philosophers. They've all become studious, tamed drones, trained in one specialty or another. They're not thinking particularly creatively. They're experimenting and studying, but it's all by rote. That's his critique. But there's an even deeper issue, and I think it's the fact that knowledge is opposed in a deep sense to human well-being. Nietzsche quotes from Lord Byron in another work, in Human All Too Human. It's like right at the beginning of I believe the second or perhaps the third book of Human All Too Human, but it's these three lines of poetic verse from Lord Byron. Quote, "Sorrow is knowledge. Those who know the most must mourn the deepest o'er the fatal truth. The tree of knowledge is not the tree of life." End quote. So there we have Byron using a Christian metaphor to overturn the basic Christian idea of goodness and truth as linked. So of course the tree of knowledge of good and evil is what Adam and Eve ate from, and because they tasted forbidden knowledge, they were expelled from the garden and expelled from their communion with God. So in that case, truth did not serve life. The tree of life, meanwhile, was a symbol of God's gift of everlasting life to mankind, which was said to be in the midst of the Garden of Eden. So this is a wonderful quotation that Nietzsche chose for expressing the problem. The unquestionability of one's values provides a sort of strength. At the zenith of an empire's power, for example, their aims and their goals and their beliefs are unquestioned. Their truths are proved by their own success. Nietzsche saw the rise of what he called the theoretical approach to life as a symptom of the decline of Hellenic Greece, for example, and indeed, something that hastened its decline. What replaced the old religious certainties of Hellenic Greece was a skeptical approach to life, a scientific worldview, optimism for the future. And so he talks about this in his 1886 preface to Birth of Tragedy. He compares this optimism to the naive fantasy of the terminal patient who imagines that somehow he will miraculously get better, because he cannot conceive of and therefore refuses to believe in his own mortality. What you desire is in some sense what you lack, and so a culture that needs optimism is a culture without a future. Whereas Nietzsche says that Greek tragedy during the time when Hellenic Greece was still vivacious and strong was a, quote, neurosis of the healthy. And I've talked about this before, but it's just important to sort of, the one piece of the puzzle here to recap is his position on Socrates and Socratism, what he broadly calls, in more general terms, the theoretic approach to life. So in that book, in Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche, I think, first really raises the issue of knowledge as threatening to life, and this is in section 7. Quote, "Knowledge kills action. Action requires the veils of illusion. That is the doctrine of Hamlet, not that cheap wisdom of Jack the Dreamer, who reflects too much and, as it were, from an excess of possibilities, does not get around to action. Not reflection, no. True knowledge, an insight into the horrible truth, outweighs any motive for action, both in Hamlet and in the Dionysian man." End quote. So even that might require a bit more explanation as to why knowledge kills action. First of all, he's of course referring to Hamlet from Shakespeare's play, who his central conflict in the play is when and how to act, and being sort of paralyzed with indecision. And Nietzsche basically alleges that this is out of an insight into the horrible truth that has paralyzed Hamlet, not just sort of, in excess of possibilities. But to further explain what he's talking about here, elsewhere in the book, he quotes from Goethe's conversations with Eckermann. It's like a series of letters between Goethe and Eckermann. He quotes a conversation where Goethe says that productivity is not simply limited to books and plays and poems, but that there is a, quote, productivity of deeds. And in the same conversation, or in quoting it, Nietzsche praises what he calls the non-theoretical man, the man of action. So we might imagine a soldier in a life or death struggle on the battlefield. The power of being unreflective, the power of being unself-critical. The power of this is you simply accept the quote-unquote truths as they're given to you by your culture or by your superiors, and when it's time to act, you simply act. The soldier who, in that situation, is self-critical and is questioning, maybe he's questioning whether the war effort is even worth it, or whether the cause is just, or whether his own nation might be at fault to some degree. Whoever were to allow these considerations to be real for him and serious, well, he's going to be impeded in his duties as a soldier. Maybe he'll die or he'll be less effective. So, most of us philosophy nerds, we don't tend to romanticize the soldier's life. So we might think, well, who cares what makes a good soldier? And to this, I would simply say, I use this example because it's a case where you face an existential threat, to yourself or to your society, or possibly to your whole way of life. And at the very least, in a battle, you face a threat to yourself, your own body and your own life. And so we can, from our coziness and our comfort behind the walls of civilization, discount the advantages of believing unquestioningly in the tenets of our society. But on the battlefield, this advantage is well known. Any situation in which our existence depends on it, acting quickly, decisively, that in that point, having an absence of self-criticism or self-reflection is paramount. I could see one arguing that conviction and self-criticism, these can coexist, but I would reply that in the moment of action, the self-criticism must be suspended, just as a brute fact. One has to win over the other in order for decision-making to be possible. There are always 1,000 doubts that can be raised against any conviction, as Descartes, shows us with his methodology of doubt. If one were to take skepticism deadly seriously and let it guide their actions, the result of this would be accordingly deadly. It would result in the inability to act at all if you doubted every single decision you made. And so the effect on the human psyche when someone fully exits the moral and the metaphysical grounding of one's culture, it is not therefore just benign or easily dismissible. Nietzsche believed that stepping outside of one's most cherished metaphysical assumptions could be very dangerous. One can lose those myths which enchanted the world and provided these intangible things like value and meaning. The degree to which someone can handle truth without having it sugar-coated, as he says, that's the real test for Nietzsche, which means, by contrast, that the truth is bitter. Maybe even the truth is poisonous, to, again, utilize the metaphor here. As Byron says, those who know the most mourn the deepest. So the truth, rather than liberating or enlivening, it often hurts. It tears away what is dear to us. And when followed zealously as the most supreme of all values, truth leads us away from all safety and comfort, and it takes a heavy psychological toll. And this is why Nietzsche often describes the truly intellectual life as difficult and rugged. You become set apart from your fellow men and their world of, moral certainties. So the thinker is not guaranteed peace of mind or a soothing balm for his suffering. It's quite the opposite. The truth is often what causes the thinker's suffering. And so Nietzsche, he made this very plain, or he stated this very plainly in an early letter to his sister. And he wrote, quote, "Here the ways of men divide. If you wish to strive for peace of soul and happiness, then believe. If you wish to be a disciple of truth, then inquire." End quote. I think in light of that, we can understand why Nietzsche saw what he called toughness or hardness as a virtue required by the free spirit. The truth is hard. It takes a tough son of a bitch to deal with the truth. Most people will not like the truth. They won't be able to handle it without an illusion, to sort of sugarcoat it. So we'll move on now to the second principle, that all truth is human. And this section is where Jordan Peterson can get his due, so to speak, because some of the conclusions one could draw from this principle could indeed lead one to the idea that truth ought to serve life. All knowledge that we have access to is inseparable from our human understanding of it. All experience of reality is inseparable from our human sense organs, insofar as we never experience reality beyond them. And therefore, we must conclude that concepts such as absolute truth, or truth with a capital T, these are contradictions in terms. If knowledge didn't create reality, if reality wasn't created by a consciousness, which would be the theistic view, reality was created by a God. So first you have consciousness and knowledge, then you have reality. But if that didn't happen, then reality began without knowledge. Knowledge then arose within beings that evolved. Conscious beings evolved from a previously unconscious world. And so that means all knowledge is held within minds which are shaped by natural processes, which means they're limited by biology, among other things. It means to speak of truth is to speak of relativity. To speak of knowledge is to speak of something which only exists embodied within multiple different perspectives, which are often contradictory with one another. in terms of the content of their knowledge, their motivations, and how they see the world, and so on. And so there is no ultimate view. And so this makes all ontological claims ultimately nonsensical. And so that's the consequence of getting rid of ontology. Nietzsche's position is what we might call, epistemic relativity, or another label for it might be perspectivism. All knowledge that humans possess is relative to the human condition. And thus, we cannot evaluate a truth statement by whether or not it approximates some ontological reality or noumenal reality, or maybe this is a better way to put it, some truth value independent of human interest or perception, because that does not exist. Truth independent of human perception, independent of human experience, independent of human desires, and so on, this does not exist. This would, if we were to take this proposition seriously, it would require us to reject the correspondence theory of truth, which in some sense that's the modernist view of truth. This is the view that truth is defined as that which most approximates or corresponds to quote-unquote reality. That is, a statement is true to the degree that it corresponds to reality, but there's no absolute standard of what constitutes reality. The most charitable that we could be to correspondence theories of truth is to relocate the reference point not to an absolute reality, but to our shared human reality, which is reality mediated through all of our sense organs and through our minds and through our expression, which is to say through language. And so we perceive reality through all these barriers which themselves distort reality. Another important thing about this is then we can't therefore talk about the level of correspondence a statement has to a dispassionate, disinterested in human reality. The truth, contrary to what the philosophers often claim, is the least dispassionate, the least disinterested thing in the world. This is sort of what Nietzsche alleges. We have no disinterested truths. No truths independent of the transformation and falsification of reality through human perception. And so how shall we evaluate truth claims without an absolute standard for what constitutes reality? Nietzsche has his ideas. So we have this passage in Beyond Good and Evil in the first chapter, which is called On the Prejudices of Philosophers. And this is aphorism 4. Quote, "The falseness of an opinion is not for us any objection to it. It is here, perhaps, that our new language sounds most strangely. The question is, how far an opinion is life-furthering, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps species-rearing." End quote. So notice that Nietzsche is not saying that what serves life ought to be regarded as truth. He admits the falseness of this hypothetical opinion we're considering. He has to admit its falseness when he says that its falseness is not any objection to it. That means that what he is saying is that the truth value, in terms of a correspondence theory of truth, is irrelevant, not that the truth value is somehow tied to the usefulness or healthfulness of the statement. Statements don't become truer because they are more life-preserving. Rather, his point is actually the opposite, that the healthfulness is what matters, and again, that this is something unrelated to the truth of the matter. And so if we take his warnings about the dangers of truth seriously, we might conclude that fostering the preservation of life and truthfulness rarely overlap. The strength of a position does not make the position true. Perhaps we might say it makes the position strong. It makes it a font of strength, and strength is simply more important than truth in this new form of future philosophy that Nietzsche is hoping for. And I've already done some explaining as to why he doesn't think that inhuman truth is possible. But if we want to really back up these arguments, we'll have to get into the weeds a little bit. But, that's why we're here, isn't it? To go into the absurd in, exhaustive detail. So one work that sheds some light on this is On Truth and Lies in the Extramoral Sense. That is an early essay that Nietzsche wrote while still at Basel. It's considered unfinished or a draft at least from my understanding, and it is relatively short. And so I'll draw quite heavily on this essay to explain this particular aspect of Nietzsche's view of the truth, in addition to some other sources as well. But on Truth and Lies, Nietzsche tries to come to an understanding of how humans, an evolved species, ever came to have anything like a drive to find truth. This question always fascinated him, and it seemed counterintuitive. So truth doesn't serve the other animals. They live entirely without history, without self-reflection, without self-criticism. Man has been taught, meanwhile, that to know and seek the truth, it's a divine duty. But if man is an evolved species, then truth is not given from on high. And this is not really a divine duty. That was simply a post hoc explanation for our truth-seeking habits. He also, in this essay, explores language as inherently linked to our mental process of concept formation. And so he anticipates Wittgenstein by half a century, and he implicitly works within the framework that language delimits the boundaries of thought. We form languages as a collective act. Language cannot be, it's not the mental production of a single individual. Our concepts, which are shaped by the limits of language, are also formed collectively. And to elaborate on this, actually, before getting into the essay, here's something from his, a bit later than that, after he left Basel, from The Gay Science, where he says, quote, "Consciousness has developed only under pressure of the need for communication, that from the start it was needed and useful only between human beings, particularly between those who commanded and those who obeyed, and that it also develops only in proportion to the degree of this utility. Consciousness is really only a net of communication between human beings. It is only as such that it had to develop. A solitary human being who lived like a beast of prey would not have needed it," end quote. And so he continued to think about these things long after the essay, but this means that the linguistic shape of our concept formation is not the product of a single, sovereign, individual reason. It means that our thought cannot be liberated from all constraints. It's limited by the horizons of the community's thought. And so through language, we represent the world to ourselves, but the very act of doing so must falsify the world to some extent within the boundaries of the concepts that our community has forged into language. And so this may first appear as though the correspondence theory of truth has a lifeline, because if we cannot have a belief in an absolute reality, at least we have this shared, agreed-upon view of reality. But, the devil is in the details, as always. And so Nietzsche writes On Truth and Lies, quote, "Every word instantly becomes a concept precisely insofar as it is not supposed to serve as a reminder of the unique and entirely individual original experience to which it owes its origin. But rather, a word becomes a concept insofar as it simultaneously has to fit countless more or less similar cases, which means, purely and simply, cases which are never equal, and thus altogether unequal. Every concept arises from the equation of unequal things," end quote. And so this is how language is another barrier of distortion. Languages can express truths, but they are only truths insofar as they are valid statements within the internal logic of those languages. In fact, language can often trick us, obscuring some things from us because of how the concepts are arranged or conflated under a single label. And so again, in spite of the early date of this essay, I've got a bunch of notes from elsewhere in his work about this one kind of issue about language. Mainly just to clarify, because when he's talking about grouping things into categories, how that equates unequal things, and why he thinks our falsification of the world holds true even when it comes to mathematics. We find in the first part of Beyond Good and Evil, for example, the quote, "Without constant falsification of the world by means of numbers, man could not live," end quote. And so why even the numbers are a falsification is because Nietzsche writes in Human All Too Human, Book 1, Section 19, Quote, "The laws of numbers assume there are identical things, but in fact nothing is identical with anything else." End quote. So why is nothing identical with anything else? What is he talking about here? Well, it's because the boundaries that a language draws around a given concept are completely arbitrary, or rather, they're contingent on our human needs and our human level of perception. So numbers, like other concepts, they're formed by abstracting the general case from the specific phenomenon. And so where we designate one tree, we might say that's a single tree over there. It would be just as correct to designate a trillion particles, or to understand the tree as only one part of the whole forest, or the root system, or the mycelial network, or the whole ecosystem, and so on. Is the tree separate from the atmosphere of oxygen, and the carbon dioxide expelled by the animals that it breathes? Are we separate from that? We designate the tree as a single phenomenon because it appears to us that way on this human level of resolution. More to the point, it appears to us that way because of our biological needs and preferences. We see individual phenomena based on what is useful for us to perceive. So this doesn't mean the things that we don't perceive are less real. It just means we don't perceive them. They're not included in the formation of the concept. In Nietzsche's notebooks in 1885, or it might be 1886, he elaborates on this theory of conscious perception as shaped by evolutionary usefulness. And so this helps contextualize his views on truth-seeking further. He writes, and this is found in Will to Power 505, quote, "Our perceptions as we understand them, i.e. the sum of all those perceptions, the becoming conscious of which was useful and essential to us and to the entire organic process, therefore, not all perceptions in general, e.g. not the electric. This means we have senses for only a selection of perceptions, those with which we have to concern ourselves in order to preserve ourselves. Consciousness is present only to the extent that consciousness is useful. It cannot be doubted that all sense perceptions are permeated with value judgments, useful and harmful, consequently pleasant or unpleasant." End quote. And so the argument is simply that if we had some advantage to gain by perceiving electric currents, as he mentions, then we would have a sense organ for doing that, but we don't. And so the very horizon of our perceptions, which make up the foundation of our conscious awareness, are shaped by preference, which is to say by the preferences dictated by evolution and natural selection. What gives us advantage is what, over the long eons, gave rise to heightened perceptions. Perception followed where the survival instinct led, or rather it followed what Nietzsche would say is on a deeper level the will to power. And so even our perceptions, they have this biological limitation to them. And then when we express those perceptions, they have this, for one, the way we make our concept formation is within this shared net of consciousness with the whole community. And then when we express it, it's through language. And so the most famous paragraph in the essay On Truth and Lies in the Extramoral Sense is key to contextualizing these Nietzschean considerations on truth. Admittedly, it kind of poses the danger of pushing, if you were leaning towards the irrationalist take on Nietzsche's view of truth, it might push you a little further towards that. But we have to disentangle it to understand the full picture. So I'll quote here again from On Truth and Lies, quote, "What then is truth? A movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified, transferred, and embellished, and which, after long usage, seem to a people to be fixed, canonical, and binding. Truths are illusions which we have forgotten are illusions. They are metaphors that have become worn out and have been drained of sensuous force, coins which have lost their embossing and are now considered as metal and no longer as coins." End quote. And so, to understand the passage, we have to understand what Nietzsche means by truth in the sense that he's talking about here. he's talking about, what he's saying, the whole concept of truth comes from. Why we talk about truth at all is because we designate certain things as true, logically valid, backed up by evidence, however you want to say it. The way we do that is by the social conventions expressed in language. So, where does truth exist? Well, truth exists in truth claims and statements about the truth, about reality. And so, what the picture he gives, or the accounting he gives of the origin of how concepts were formed in language. Well, he says, a sound, a symbol, a marking comes to stand for a meaning. By means of some expression or some vocalization, early humans indicated something. And so he goes on to describe in the essay, to use the usual designations was advantageous to all involved. So if you meant to indicate poisonous, but instead you indicated harmless, right? You used the wrong designation. This could be very dangerous to other people. And so once man begins to communicate, then to be truthful that's advantageous to the whole community. And this is why we've always had a high social value placed on truth. To give the conventional designation for a thing becomes associated with morality. But if you were to use your words in a way such that you don't use the conventional designation, intentionally saying one thing and doing another, for example, or, intentionally designating harmless when poisonous would be the correct linguistic indicator, then you become regarded as immoral because you've become a threat to the community. So, for all the irrationalist fuel that this passage provides in this unfinished essay, what Nietzsche is doing is he's searching for a naturalistic explanation of truth-seeking. He treats the phenomenon of the truth drive, the will to truth, as a genuine phenomenon to explain and unravel. And this is his attempt, and I think he gives us a believable hypothesis. And so to sum up the argument, Nietzsche argues the concept of truth first originates from our duty to use the usual metaphors. So that lines up, more or less, with the Wittgenstein idea that a word's meaning is determined by the common use. Language is not, arbitrary on the private level or on the individual level. It's determined by collective agreement. Furthermore, truth is not something given from on high or something existing within a world beyond, but something that we grew to seek after, something we adapted to value, something which we found had usefulness for us. And so that's, again, a very different story from the Christian view, or even from the scientific realist view of the truth that exists in secular society today, which does still seem to hold to some idea of like the dispassionate, disinterested in human truth. And I still hear the correspondence theory of truth, expressed often. During this early period of his writing, when he was writing on truth and lies, some have interpreted Nietzsche as a Neokantian. This does not mean he was in agreement with Kant or a disciple of Kant. It means that he worked within the framework that Kant had established, as Kant's influence on German philosophy was so great that it demanded a response. And I think there was something to the idea that Nietzsche carried through that idea of the phenomena-noumena division to its logical conclusion. And this is the division of the world of mere appearances and the true world, as we discussed in the very first episode. How Nietzsche sees the inaccessibility of the true world as its own refutation. And so at that time in Germany, there were a number of Neo-Kantians, scientists and philosophers of science that attempted to verify Kant's ideas through experiment. And the implications of the world we experience being a mere representation created by our sense organs, this raises the question, well, then would a being with different sense organs experience a different world? And so figures such as Hermann von Helmholtz therefore attempted to study the nervous systems of, various animals and their sense faculties, get some idea of how some, other creatures would construct a representation of the world. So could they perhaps sense these other natural phenomena that we do not, such as the electrical field? Von Helmholtz was a scientist and a philosopher of science and a Neokantian in his approach. And we know that von Helmholtz was very influential on Nietzsche. Von Helmholtz expressed the Neokantian perspective in 1853. So I'll quote, "Perhaps the relation between our senses and the external world may be best enunciated as follows. Our sensations are for us only symbols of the objects of the external world, and correspond to them only in some such way as written characters or articulate words to the things they denote. They give us, it is true, information respecting the properties of things without us, but no better information than we give a blind man about color by verbal descriptions." End quote. And this is basically the Neokantian perspective on knowledge in a nutshell. Empirical reasoning in the form of science can tell us about the phenomenal world, but all this knowledge comes to us through the filter of the senses, which means it never escapes the phenomenal world. Nietzsche, so to speak, accepts the same concern, but he further added, as we mentioned, that language itself is another barrier. And we should keep in mind, though, that these claims about knowledge were not, at the time, postmodern or anti-scientific or irrationalist, but grounded within the spirit of scientific investigation. Nietzsche, as a philologist, was himself a scientist. Philology was considered a Wissenschaft in the German university system at the time. Von Helmholtz was in the hard sciences, even by today's standards, and he also, expressed the same position. And so Nietzsche even goes so far as to suggest that the scientific approach to reality is what may help us undermine the type of idealism that believes in, the truth with the capital T, attainable by the human mind. The inhuman truth can be encapsulated within our reason. And this is because science, Popper would later frame it this way, but science works by falsifying hypotheses, not by verifying truths. Science is always overturning past doctrines. It further sort of provides a sketch of the laws of nature. And so Nietzsche writes on Truth and Lies that science can, quote, dig successfully in this shaft forever, end quote. And so he says, science has discovered more and more regularity in the natural world. And so this has acted as a seal of confirmation. So he says, quote, "How little does this regularity resemble a product of the imagination," end quote. And so if science were simply pure subjectivity and thus purely the product of the mind, we would not expect the kinds of results, the kind of regularity we see from scientific investigation. So this is not a denial of the quote-unquote, objective world, which is to say, the world is not purely the product of human imagination. That would be an ontological claim, and that's not the argument. If anything, the argument is that we cannot represent a merely objective world. It must be a mix of the objective and the human. That is what the world of phenomena is. Phenomena are experienced and represented, and thus they're distorted by consciousness and by concept formation. And yet, within this world of phenomena, we can use the sciences to discover patterns and laws. And so he's not denying any of that. He's affirming it. But so Nietzsche's he's never one to just only come down on one side of the issue. And so he turns about and he critiques the faith in science in the same paragraph. Quote, "Against this, the following must be said. If each of us had a different kind of sense perception, if we could only perceive things now as a bird, now as a worm, now as a plant, or if one of us saw a stimulus as red, another as blue, while a third even heard the same stimulus as a sound, then no one would speak of such a regularity of nature. Rather, nature would be grasped only as a creation which is subjective in the highest degree. After all, what is a law of nature as such for us? We are not acquainted with it in itself, but only with its effects." End quote. And so we see here in Nietzsche's thought a clear resemblance to the von Helmholtz quote. This is a concern with the distance between the world of the senses and the noumenon, but once again Nietzsche is pointing to the conclusion of these considerations, that the idea of truths independent of human knowledge becomes more and more absurd. Both Nietzsche's criticism of, scientism and his praise of science, where it is due, speak to the same underlying idea. All of our truths are inescapably human. Science is useful insofar as it humbles us and reminds us of our limited human framework for understanding, and so far as it is understood as knowledge of the phenomenal world, i.e., not knowledge of so-called objective truths. But science is harmful insofar as we forget to put science in its proper context and think it can bring us the truth with a capital T, which is basically the faith that human knowledge can escape humanity. When we imagine that science is a magical thing that can escape the limits of humanity, we are doing the same thing that the moral realist is doing, for example. We're trying to take our knowledge, which is motivated and interested and bound by the human condition from the very start, and we're going to try and take that and make it into something separate from us, something disembodied, something akin to a Platonic form. None of this means that we can't distinguish between a statement about an objective fact in the sense of referring to the properties of an object and not a subject versus, say, a moral claim. The objective-subjective distinction can still exist as two separate concepts in language, and in fact they must exist. But this all exists within the world of human truths, not disembodied truths. And so now, with the remaining time, we'll briefly touch on the third and final principle that humans need lies, which might probably be somewhat intuitively clear now, since it's implied by many of Nietzsche's other statements that I've quoted up to this point. This position may be roughly described as, one word for it might be fictionalism. So remember, it's not the truth or falsity of a judgment that matters to Nietzsche, but the healthfulness of a judgment that really matters. We therefore possess a need to believe things that are irrational or unjustified or unprovable. This is because as we pursue greater knowledge of the world, digging in this mine shaft of scientific knowledge, for instance, we find that we undermine through this truth-seeking things like values. Again, the relevant distinction that Nietzsche attacks is not objective versus subjective, but human versus inhuman. Grounded within the world of human knowledge and experience, we can discover objective truths through science, truths we discover about objects, about inanimate things and natural processes and physical laws and so on. But, rather than a truth statement about a subject or subjective human concerns such as values. But he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, in one of the most important sentences in that work, quote, "Behind logic and its seeming sovereignty of movement stand valuations, which is to say, physiological demands for the preservation of a certain way of life." End quote. So we can have a system of internal logic based on a series of first principles. But those first principles, the axioms of your system, are arbitrary. And they're arbitrary from a logical standpoint. So we can say that if one is a utilitarian and believes that reducing the total sum of suffering and death is the highest good, the greatest good for the greatest many, when presented with two courses of action, one of which kills 5 people and the other one, kills 1 person, it's logical to take the course that kills only 1, prevent the most suffering. But the first principle upon which you're acting, that the greatest good for the greatest many, that is not itself logical. It's, on some sense, just a arbitrary principle that you've settled on. You can always ask why, and you can follow that back to infinity. That's the ought-is chasm. And so as we apply our truth-seeking to everything in the domain of human knowledge, as this totalizing will to truth becomes the all-encompassing value, we find that these subjective truths, they don't really comply with our systems of logic and reason. We find that our reason must be motivated by something, but that we do not get our motivations by logic. What drives us is what we might call the pre-rational, or the non-rational. We define concepts such as goodness, justice, morality, and so on. But the arbitrariness of our first principles prevents us from speaking about them in an absolute sense. There can be justice within a given system, but not justice in and of itself. There can be morality or goodness relative to a certain moral code, but not the good as such. Those are internally contradictory ideas. As Nietzsche asks in his famous attack on the Stoics, and this is in Beyond Good and Evil as well, he says, quote, "Is not living valuing, preferring, being unjust," end quote. As we said before, preference laces every cell of every living organism, and not for logical reasons, but for physiological reasons. Our very perceptions are delimited by this drive to self-advantage, and what we focus on within those perceptions is defined by that same drive. And then out of this, judgments form as the inevitable conclusion of those limitations. And this means that truth, as Nietzsche writes, is something which rests on a foundation of error. Our reason works towards goals which are not themselves reasonable, but simply demands. And so we arrive at this inevitable conclusion that since our values are needed for living, and since we need goals and meaning and truth and so on, that by that same token, humans need lies. And that includes, for the most part, all of our spiritual and religious traditions. And so, and I don't mean to be disrespectful there. I'm not saying that they're intentional falsehoods. Rather, human beings we have a tendency to take experiences, feelings, ideas, and paint them onto the whole universe. And over time, we forget the origins of these beliefs. They attain a mystical character. We forget that an observation was merely relative to our own time and place, and we universalize it to all mankind or to existence itself. And so this is what he means in the passage from On Truth and Lies in the or extramoral sense that I quoted earlier. He says, truths are illusions, we've forgotten our illusions. And so this is where it's important to, introduce yet another nuance, because mankind needs both truth and falsehood, rationality and irrationality. And Nietzsche accepts both, because both are part of the whole person. So, one of his projects throughout his career is the reconciliation of man's rational needs with his irrational needs. We can't say that man can do without truth entirely, even if we were speaking simply of human truths, as we've described them. Because without some means of knowing the truth, we cannot survive. Remember, these perceptions that we have are aimed at our survival and our advantage and our flourishing. The drive for power, it's axiomatic. It's not itself proven by rationality. And this is what Nietzsche thinks all things seek after. And so when we examine the multifarious drives within a person or within all mankind, we find that many of them are irrational, and that reason plays this role as the tool used by the drives to achieve their ends. And so in one of Nietzsche's notes, he says that reason is a relationship and an organizing force that exists between man's irrational drives. I believe that's how he puts it. I don't have the quote in front of me at the moment, but so since the rational exists on this foundation of the irrational, as we've said, then from an anthropological standpoint, we develop the rational drive, the truth drive, as a means of satisfying irrational goals. And so we have this will to truth, and because we begin to see truthfulness as moral, we began to see the lie, accordingly, as immoral. And this led to the idea that truth-seeking is good in and of itself. And so the will to truth, it's a transformation of the underlying thing driving all life, which is the will to power. And so that's Nietzsche's ultimate explanation of where the truth-seeking drive comes from. The problem is that now this will to truth is attacking the ends which it was created as the means to serve. So, Nietzsche says that ends is power, but you might look, at bottom in a human being to say that it's like exists in the form of our instincts or the irrational drives to fight and to procreate and survive and so on. This truth drive challenges and tries to eliminate the irrational, which is the very thing that gave rise to it. And so we could say that the will to truth, taken to the extreme, is unhealthy because it is self-defeating. Nietzsche's project, it can be understood, in one sense, as an attempt to find the way to satisfy the will to truth, but in a healthy manner, which means in a manner that doesn't undermine our necessary fictions. We can't really sum up this whole examination of Nietzsche's view of truth without including that he himself obviously found an immense value in the pursuit of truth. And again, Nietzsche is a philosopher. He's a philologist in this part of the sciences. He is a truth seeker. What sets him apart from other philosophers is that he's honest about what truth-seeking is, and he understands the value of untruth. And so the last passage we'll look at is from The Gay Science. And I've chosen it because it gives it's a very different, an almost oppositional message to the Jordan Peterson truth ought to serve life idea. It really reads almost like a direct refutation of that characterization of Nietzsche. But far, far more important than that, it's one of my all-time favorite passages from Nietzsche. And it speaks to the character of the man as a truth seeker, but it's a great passage. It's called In Media Vita, which means in the middle of life, and it's The Gay Science number 324. Quote, "No, life has not disappointed me. On the contrary, I find it truer, more desirable, and mysterious every year. Ever since the day when the great liberator came to me, the idea that life could be an experiment of the seeker for knowledge, and not a duty, not a calamity, not a trickery. And knowledge itself, let it be something else for others, for example, a bed to rest on, or the way to such a bed, or a diversion, or a form of leisure. For me, it is a world of dangers and victories in which heroic feelings, too, find places to dance and play. Life as a means to knowledge. With this principle in one's heart, one can live not only boldly, but even gaily, and laugh gaily too. And who knows how to laugh anyway, and live well, if he does not first know a good deal about war and victory." End quote. So, it's not that the truth ought to serve life, but that to Nietzsche the good life was life as a means to knowledge. As much as he critiqued the unhealthy expression of the will to truth in society at large, and even especially among scholars and academia, Nietzsche considered that there were some people who could tolerate more truth than others. The truly free spirit will have the intellectual toughness for that. And so here we see in full relief, again, the Nietzschean warrior mentality towards philosophy. That the pursuit of knowledge can take this form as conflict or a quest or struggle in which one overcomes obstacles and endures hard realities and receives rewards only upon a hard-fought victory. And so this is a heroic form of philosophy. And, maybe in Nietzsche's view, the great majority would be better off to avoid too much truth-seeking, but the warrior philosopher is measured by how much truth he can endure. And, actually, at the end, if we recall the simple formulation from the letter to Nietzsche's sister, here are the ways of men divide. If you wish to strive for peace of soul and happiness, then believe. If you wish to be a disciple of truth, then inquire. Jordan Peterson is a great example of someone who tells his audience that if they want to strive for peace of the soul and happiness, they must believe. And so he uses, or perhaps abuses, this simplified idea of Nietzsche's that truth serves life in order to try and convince, an increasingly atheistic society to ignore the unbelievability of Christianity and simply return to, the safety of its ideas. Nietzsche, meanwhile, is a disciple of truth. His way is to inquire. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.